as a professor not only teach, but we also try to figure out, to research, to find information about different topics. So Professor Dr. R. Wilson has been researching for a long, how many years now? Oh, not so bad. 15 years about pragmatism. So he's going to publish, he already published one book about one of the most important pragmatists. And he's going to publish another book. It was two. But in the near future. So he's going to share some of the basic of research with us. He's going to share it in a way that the students and professors can understand, but also he's going to share like the most important advances in his research. In the future, we will have other professors who are going to share their research. And we're very happy that you come here. Like the idea is to have a friendly discussion, a friendly dialogue in which you can see how do philosophies work, yeah, as a professor. So I'm very thankful with the two professors who have come before, Professor Dr. Bailey and Dr. Wilson, and I'm very thankful with them and with all of you for coming in. Thank you a lot.
Thank you, Professor Ochoa, for organizing these. Yeah. So I anticipated some students will be here. So this is going to be, I'm not going to just present, start off assuming a lot of knowledge about pragmatism or about a particular pragmatist, Charles Sanders Peirce, who I specialize in. So I'm giving an introduction, and then it's going to start to focus on Peirce's pragmatism in particular. And then basically by the end, you'll sort of see kind of what, for me, is particularly important in Peirce's pragmatism. But what is pragmatism? We have professors here, we have students, varying degrees of familiarity with pragmatism. You probably already know that it's something like a school of thought or a philosophical tradition. Maybe you know some of the names like Peirce, James, Dewey, and so on. But does anybody want to take a shot at what the key idea is thought to be in pragmatism, what the pragmatism's key idea is? Like, don't. It's totally fine if you don't. Just kind of curious if anybody would, right? Have this idea of what pragmatism is about. No reason why any of you particularly should. Well, if you ask kind of mainstream philosophers, academic philosophers today, they will say that the key idea behind pragmatism is something like what they call anti-representationalism. Hey. Uh-oh. I gotta move that. The idea of anti-representationalism is the idea that mind and language do not mirror, reflect, or represent an independent reality so much as mind and language consists in these rules or directives or norms, as they're called, for navigating our social and physical environments. So you've got this kind of philosophically old idea, kind of old metaphor for the way the mind works, the way language works, that it's, you have a reality on one end, and then, we have mind and language on the other side, and when mind and language get reality right, that's kind of like an accurate mirror or reflection of the way reality actually is in itself, right? Pragmatism, or the way, again, it's mostly understood today, says no to that, and says that, mind and language is more like a railroad track or maybe like a road. It's not something independent of the world that it tries to get right. Instead, it's just something that gets us through it, right? And so mind and language kind of reflect the world as only as much as a railroad track does, which is saying not very much, right? But specifically, the idea is that thoughts and sentences, they don't reflect, right? Or when they are true, they don't necessarily reflect independent reality. Instead, what thoughts and sentences do is they express intentions, expectations, commitments, permissions, or other social norms, and that's basically all they do. So, for example, right? Adding it a little bit. So the sentence, or the proposition, the earth is round, right? Again, it doesn't necessarily reflect an independent reality. Instead, what the sentence does is it expresses things like solidarity with science. It commits one to asserting also that the earth has no edge. It gives off normie vibes, right? You're not a flat earther. And that, according to kind of contemporary pragmatism, And this is the conception of pragmatism that became particularly dominant after philosopher Richard Rorty published his famous book, Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, and then the follow-up to that, Consequences of Pragmatism. And so he was very influential in casting pragmatism as this kind of anti-representationalist about mind and language, but particularly about language. Right, so just a couple excerpts here, right? So according to this guy at the top here, for the pragmatist, true sentences are not true because they correspond to reality. So no need to worry about what makes a sentence true. Rorty was very influential, and so you have a number of people here who identify as pragmatists in the representationalist form. Hugh Price, this guy over in the middle here, says pragmatists have traditionally been enemies of representationalism. Michael Williams, who's not pictured here in the same volume, wrote that the heart of pragmatism is anti-representationalism. James and Dewey think of belief in functionalist terms as mediating between perception and action. Right? So these contemporary pragmatists do attribute this anti-representationalism to these other historical philosophers, early 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century philosophers, John Dewey and William James. That's primarily where they get it from. Primarily they get it from William James, who's pictured at the bottom here. Maybe some of you might be more familiar with William James. He might have been mentioned in your psychology class, founder of the Functionalist School of Psychology. But he himself wrote the following, and it's kind of his pragmatism. It's not always consistently anti-representationalist sounding, but it often does sound that way. Right? He wrote that the popular idea that a true idea must copy its reality. Right? That's the popular idea. Pragmatism, on the other hand, asks its usual question: what, in short, is the truth's cash value in experiential terms? The possession of true thoughts means everywhere the possession of invaluable instruments of action. So again, his kind of the idea that if you actually read James, it's a little bit confusing because there are times where he just kind of actually doesn't, he seems like a representationalist. But his main idea is that the truth is, and it's not just that the truth is useful, it's that its usefulness is constituent of the truth. To say that a sentence is true is to say that it's useful in some way, and that's all it is to say, that it's true, right? When our representations get things right, it just is a guide to action and successful action at that. So he has this term pragmatism. So where did William James get this idea from? Anybody want to take a guess where James got it from? Peirce, there you go, good. They were Harvard buddies, or they were buddies back in Harvard. There's this book by Louis Manon called The Metaphysical Club that kind of details, somewhat controversially, the history of these philosophers back at Harvard in the early 1870s. What James is referring to as pragmatism and attributing it to Peirce, we're going to go back to that attribution in a little bit. He's referring to this right here. In this article called How to Make Our Ideas Clear, published in 1878, Peirce develops this framework for clarifying ideas that goes in gradual steps. This first grade of clearness is familiarity. Second grade of clearness is giving just a basic analytic definition of the idea. And then he introduces this third grade of clearness, so this rule for attaining the third grade of clearness in our ideas. And that's what it's supposed to be right there. It goes, consider what effects that might conceivably have practical bearings. We conceive the object of our conception to have. Then our conception of these effects is the whole of our conception of the object. So yeah, this was called the rule for attaining the third grade of clearness in our ideas. That's what Peirce originally called it. He didn't originally call it pragmatism or rule of maximum pragmatism. After James started popularizing the idea, Peirce started calling it the maximum pragmatism. And then after Peirce died, commentators started calling it the pragmatic maximum. Our question is, right, is this anti-representationalist? Is this giving us a view of meaning or view of concepts or conceptions where concepts are not really about mirroring or representing reality, but just trying to get us through reality? And, he's talking about practical bearings, but he's talking about the meaning of a concept being the effects that have practical bearings, so it's not entirely clear if it's anti-representationalist. We look at the examples he gives of the application of this rule. And he first applies this rule for clarifying ideas to the concept of hard. And he says that if we apply this rule for attaining the highest grade of clearness to the concept of hard, we get that hard means that something that's hard will not be scratched by many other substances. And then he applies it to the concept of heavy, and he said that, well, what heavy means is that in the absence of opposing force, heavy objects will fall. And then he finally applies it to force, and he says, well, what force means is that if bodies were left to themselves without the intervention of forces, every motion would continue unchanged in both velocity and direction. So you look at these, and you're thinking, huh? What exactly do practical bearings have to do with these clarifications of the concept, right? I mean, all of these can have practical bearings, right? If something is heavy and it's falling, you want to get out of the way. But what Peirce is calling practical bearings, which if you think of the practical norms, practical aims, don't seem to be intrinsic or inherent to these clarifications at all, right? There's no mention of anything really directly practical in his explanations here, right? You don't really see anything practical kind of built into the concepts, his clarification of the concepts, until he then moves to apply his principle of pragmatism to the concept of reality. And that's really what he's doing in this 1878 paper. He's really just introducing, in my opinion, introducing this rule for attaining the highest grade of clearness to try to justify his metaphysical view of reality. But he says that, yeah, if you apply this rule to the concept of reality, then he gives a kind of an argument for this, right, which of course is short. He says that, well, reality means at its highest grade of clearness is that the opinion which is fated to be ultimately agreed to by all who investigate is what we mean by the truth, and the object represented in this opinion is the real. That is the way I would explain reality. So here we have something practical. We have practice at least built in to this clarification of reality, right? Investigative practice, inquiry, right? But one thing we want to notice is that that's on the truth side, right? On the truth end of this clarification, we see practical ends and norms kind of mentioned or referenced in some way. But it's still unmistakably representationless, right? Truth is the opinion, right? Truth is identified as the opinion which is fated to be agreed upon by all who investigate. And then what's represented in this opinion is the real. Okay? So it's still representations. This Peirce doesn't really do too much with this rule for attaining the highest grade of clearness after this paper. Right? I think it's a lot just trying to build up this analysis of reality, of what reality is. He doesn't bring it up again. He doesn't bring up this maxim again until much later, right? Just a little aside about Charles Peirce, about the man. He was born on September 10th, 1839. I share a birthday with him, September 10th. And he was born into pretty high privilege. His father, Benjamin Peirce, was an eminent mathematician at Harvard. And he really did a lot to try to train Charles to be this super genius. And he was a real genius, right? He mastered languages. He allegedly read one of the hardest books in philosophy to read, Conspiracy of Pure Reason, by the time he was 13. But I think his father also did some damage to him personally. I think maybe put a little bit too much pressure on him. And he developed, I think, some personality issues. There's some interesting biographies about this. He was really hard to get along with. He rubbed people very the wrong way. He worked most of the time as a scientist. Most of his income was from being actually a scientist, right? This guy, Charles Peirce, was probably one of the last great polymaths. He was a chemist, he was a geologist, he did psychology, he did physics, he did astronomy, right? Most of them actually income he earned was actually from his scientific work, not his philosophical work. So we had like temporary appointments in philosophy departments, but because he really didn't get along with people that well, and because he was not afraid to irritate people who had power also, he never actually had a secure job. So as he aged, he became poorer and poorer, right? And by the 1890s, he didn't really have a stable source of income. And so his buddy William James wanted to really help him. And one of the ways James decided to try to help him was to make this big lecture he was going to give at the Philosophical Union of California at UC Berkeley in 1898. That was around the time, right? the UC system was new, and maybe I think James was thinking he could possibly get Peirce back on the map and get Peirce maybe an appointment at one of the UC schools. So James devoted his lecture to Peirce's pragmatism, as he called it, right? It's going all the way back to the article that Peirce wrote 20 years ago. And Peirce, instantly from James's lecture, pragmatism started to gain a lot of popularity. People started talking about it a lot more, thanks to James. And of course, Peirce is getting into this, and now he kind of has to, especially if he wants to, this is what Peirce is becoming known for, is pragmatism. And he realized that if he maybe wants to get some success, he has to go back to this rule for clarifying his ideas, which James called pragmatism, and try to make something more of it, try to develop it fully, right? So Peirce doesn't really develop his pragmatism until around 1900, until starting in the 1900s. And in 1903, right, Peirce is still pretty poor here because of Peirce's various medical and personality issues, still pretty poor, even 5 years after this address by James. James also then generously arranged for Peirce to give 6 lectures at Harvard, all of which would be paid. And the lectures were supposed to be entirely on pragmatism. And Peirce, he starts out in his first lecture with a reformulation of his idea that he espoused back in 1878. And he says, well, okay, according to pragmatism, or that pragmatism is the principle that every theoretical judgment expressible in a sentence in the indicative mood is a confused form of thought whose only meaning, if it has any, lies in its tendency to enforce a corresponding practical maxim expressible as a conditional sentence having its apodosis in the imperative. You guys all got that? Right. No, very convoluted. James was furious. William James was angry. He made his lectures very inaccessible, right? And as the lectures go on, they become gradually more accessible, and Peirce is kind of developing out his whole philosophical system, right? But one thing about this, a lot of my colleagues really like this one. A lot of contemporary pragmatists love this, because basically what it's saying is that the meaning of any descriptive statement lies with some kind of conditional command or conditional imperative. For example, right, the earth is round means something like this, that one of the things that it means that if you want to go the shortest distance around the earth, then use curved routes, right? It's a command, it's an imperative, and that's basically what he's saying here, that the meaning of any sentence, the meaning of any proposition lies actually in an imperative or conditional, a practical imperative, right? And so this, now, Peirce has casted pragmatism as unmistakably anti-representationalism. So it seems like maybe Peirce has, kind of go back and reconsider and thought, yeah, no, I don't want to have this idea of concepts being in any ways mirrors of reality, that it really is all about, our concepts are really all about just directing action, right, or guiding action. Well, Peirce, he continues in the lectures, and by the end of the 6th lecture, he realizes that he is not comfortable with that formulation of pragmatism. And he starts talking a lot more about perception towards the end of these lectures. And at the very end of this 7th lecture, this unplanned 7th lecture that Peirce insisted on giving because he did not really have his thoughts very clear on what pragmatism is in earlier lectures, he gives this reformulation of pragmatism. He says that according to pragmatism, the elements of every concept enter into logical thought at the gate of perception and make their exit at the gate of purposive action. And whatever cannot show its passports at each gate is to be arrested as unauthorized by reason. Well, maybe we can discuss that.
Yeah.
So a couple of questions here, right? This is definitely different, very different from what we saw in 1878, different from what we saw even earlier in the lectures. It's not clearly representational, it's not clearly anti-representationalist. We ask, well, what exactly is entering at perception? What exactly is exiting at deliberate action? Right? I mean, traditionally, representations are thought to enter in perception, but not exit in deliberate action, right? So perception is traditionally thought to be in some way representational, right? And part of deliberate action is normative. So what exactly are these elements that Peirce is talking about? This is where we finally start to see Peirce getting clear on his pragmatism and realizing that it does have to integrate in some way both the normative and the representation. So I have to do this. Get a little bit into Peirce's semiotics. I was toying with the idea of not getting into it at all, and my peers, this is where I'd probably get attacked with this, right? It's the most controversial area of Peirce's blog. Semiotics is, for Peirce, the study of signs and how they signify their quote-unquote objects, right? And he developed semiotics over the course of his life with a particular explosion in the early 1900s. And I think he really developed his semiotics a lot in order to help clarify what his idea of pragmatism. But one of the things that is consistent throughout his work on the study of signs is this model of signification, essentially, or what you would call semiosis. That semiosis or signification essentially involves not two things, not a sign and then what the sign stands for, the object, but rather three things: the sign, the object, and what he calls the interpretant. And the interpretant is just anything that acts, according to him, as an interpreter. Something that takes a sign and interprets that sign as standing for some object. That's what the interpretant does, right? And he says this is fundamental. You can't have a sign-object relation without an interpretant, which means that essentially all signs require interpretation in order to be a sign of anything. And this might seem pretty representationalist, right? Because we're talking about signs and what they stand for. Not necessarily, though. You might say that, well, if all signs require interpretation to stand for an object, then maybe what the object ultimately is just sort of this formal nominal thing that's created by our interpretive practices. That the object doesn't really have any independent existence. It's just whatever we happen to interpret a sign as being, right? Not too many people defend this interpretation of Peirce's semiotics, and for good reason. And the reason is that Peirce makes this distinction between the object. The object is, right, just a key term here. When he's talking about objects, he's also including basically anything we can have a sign for, right? Or anything we can signify somewhat. But he says, well, look, there's the immediate object. And the immediate object is whatever a sign is interpreted to be a sign of. Right? You interpret a thumbs up as a sign of, good job. Right? That's the object there, right? Good job. If you're from another culture, maybe you're going to take this as an insult. But it's just whatever you have to interpret the sign as being a sign. That's the immediate. But then there's this, what he calls the dynamical object, that all signs, well, almost all signs, have a dynamical object. And it says the dynamical object is the reality by which some means contrives to determine the sign to its representation. What is that? Well, okay, the dynamical object is a real thing, it's a reality. And for Peirce, that means that it has an independent existence. It has an independent of being interpreted. It's not being interpreted. But in some way, the reality is supposed to have this influence. The dynamical object has an influence on the sign interpretation. In such a way that that reality will contrive the sign interpretation process to interpret the sign as a sign of that particular object. But what exactly does that mean? What does it mean for an object to contrive a sign to its representation? And he introduces this interpretant that he calls the final interpretant. And the final interpreton is that which he says would finally be decided to be the true interpretation if consideration of the matter were carried so far that an ultimate opinion were reached. So what the reality is doing, what this real object is doing, is it's affecting the interpretive practices in such a way that gradually over time, you would arrive at a quote-unquote final interpreton, which, remember, in that 1878 paper, Peirce defined truth as the opinion that's fated to be agreed upon by all who investigate. So there's the direct connection here. The final interpreton is the interpretation of a sign at that would-be final opinion. Right? If people continue to investigate, continue to interpret signs, then they would eventually come to and rest in a specific interpretation of the sign. Right? Insofar as belief is concerned, right? A little caveat there. So, okay. What I'm giving you now is just the overall picture of what's happening, what's going on here. First, all sign interpretation directed towards belief, and not all sign interpretation is directed towards belief. Sign interpretation goes to be playful, right? But all sign interpretation directed towards belief is directed towards practical conduct, right? This is belief, according to Peirce, consists in these habits of deliberate conduct. That's essentially what belief is. And all signs caught up in that process then are also then directed towards practical conduct as well. Practical conduct comes with expectations, whether the conduct will be successful and what the intention behind the conduct, right? What the conduct was aiming at. And then failures, according to Peirce, failures of such conduct will tend, not always, but tend to prompt a process of self-correction that would modify belief in conduct. So you have a belief, you believe that the earth is round, that if you walk, you'll never come to an edge. Right? Let's suppose you do come to an edge. Oh, right, that was unexpected. That's going to, according to Peirce, eventually prompt a process of self-correction where you're going to revise your beliefs and revise your conduct, revise your habits of conduct. And then, so essentially what this is, what Peirce is talking about, is that this is, in my view, essentially forming a process of practical adaptation of a sign interpreter to their reality that, would tend towards a kind of ideal stability, right? A limit at which no interaction between the interpreter and the reality can prompt further correction. In other words, belief is fixed. Basic idea here is that if we continue to inquire, if we were to live indefinitely, let's say, or if society and civilization were to continue indefinitely, that over time, reality will compel us to revise our beliefs, revise our interpretive practices, such that eventually we would represent reality in a certain way, and it would be fixed in that way, indefinitely. And why is that? Well, beliefs consist in these habits, and habits have these inertia. So you're going to have the same belief until that belief gets disturbed in some way by some expectation that the belief sets that is disappointing. So the idea is that over time, false beliefs would eventually be filtered out, right? And then we would rest in only true beliefs. But what it means for a belief to be true is just that you have this kind of ideal stability between our beliefs on one hand and reality on the other. I have a kind of diagram here. I know it's already 4:30. Maybe I might skip some of this, but this is basically kind of the process, right? You have the object or the dynamical object, you have the reality, it affects our perception, right? The interpretive process begins with perception, right? And how we perceive things affects the interpretation of our signs, right? And then signs are interpreted through our practical norms and conduct, which in turn is an interaction with the external reality, with the object. And then there's a feedback process, right? The object then might affect our perception differently in a way we didn't expect, right? There could be a disturbance or a dissonance. And what that would do, according to Peirce, is eventually prompt correction. And so what you have, right? Let me stop and give a couple of examples because I'm kind of talking, right? Just real quick, a little funny story that is a good example of this. When I was really young, I would refuse to eat hamburgers because I didn't like ham. And I thought hamburgers had ham on them. Right? I would only eat cheeseburgers. And I would see mom would accidentally get me a ham or a cheeseburger, but they would put a hamburger in there. Like, oh well, they forgot the hams. And then I've seen other hamburgers, right? Friends get hamburgers, and oh, they forgot the hamburger. Of course, people's testimony has an effect on what I believe. What are you talking about? Hamburgers. It's called hamburgers. That's what ground up beef is called, right? So that's basically kind of like a process of self-correction there, and of course, obviously, I have kind of a fixed belief about what hamburger is, about what hamburger is. But another example would be something like just using what are called natural kinds of philosophy. Right, at one point in time, people thought of water and fire as kind of elemental, fundamental substances, right? But then, of course, people notice things that when water is heated, it gives off steam, and it can change form and all that. And you got the rise of ancient atomism, right? The idea that actually these substances, fire, earth, water, are not fundamental. Rather, they are composed of atoms that are imperceptible, really tiny. Right? There's a process of self-correction there as well. And, a lot happens. It's not for almost another 2,000 years that we have the mathematics and we have the techniques to learn a little bit more about these atoms, and then eventually find out, water is actually two atoms of hydrogen bonding with one atom of oxygen, right? It's eventually H2O. And there's still the reality that the process is still going. As long as we continue to exist and as long as we continue to have experiences, it's possible in the future that that object will continue to affect us in such a way that we'll need to continue to correct, right? And the point here, then, is that when what Peirce, the model that Peirce is building of representation, is that actually the relation of a sign to the object is a whole dynamical process of learning through experience. That is, it's not a simple dyadic relation, it's actually a very complex would-be relation, where gradually the sign would represent the reality if experience and inquiry were to continue. It's not a simple, this is a sign, that's its object, simple mirror kind of relationship. It's actually a very complex relationship. And sort of a way of kind of diagramming this in 3 dimensions here, right? Sign, object, and as we continue to have experiences, as we continue to acquire, right? The sign and the object kind of grow more stable. Interpretive practice, the way we interpret our signs, the way we interpret the world, gradually settles, gradually becomes more stable as a result of these ongoing dynamical interactions between ourselves and the rest of reality. And it's not necessarily the case that we ever will reach this final opinion, this ideal stability. Right? It might not be completely impossible, in fact, but it will tend towards it. Right? It's a kind of limit. And so, according to Peirce, a belief is true or a sign interpretation is correct if it would be fixed in the long run of experience and inquiry. And what I want to emphasize here is that this is not a criterion for truth. It's not a way to tell that a sentence or a proposition is true. Obviously, you don't know what propositions are going to be fixed at the end of inquiry. But for Peirce, what pragmatism fundamentally about is just clarifying what it means to correctly represent the world. So conclusion, so I would say Peirce is not quite an anti-representationalist, right? The contemporary pragmatists tend to avoid Peirce because of all the representationalist idioms that you do find in Peirce, and I think it's good for them to kind of avoid Peirce. He's not quite anti-representationalist about, however, he does change the metaphor, right? He changes the metaphor from representation or correct representation being a mirror of an independent reality to that of being a kind of practical adaptation to it. That's the way we should think of truth. But we don't have to give up saying that, yeah, we represent the world. And to emphasize, practical norms are essential to this dynamical process by which our beliefs and interpretations would gradually become fixed and stable. And again, sadly, humanity might go extinct or might die out before the final opinion or the final interpretation is ever reached. Still, Peirce would insist, yeah, even that happens, even if, we all die out before we really can achieve this ideal stability with reality, it still remains true that with enough experience, the final opinion or interpretation would be reached, or indefinitely. And I'm going to end with my favorite quotation from Peirce. I love this. He says, look, if you take the most pig-headed and passionate of men, who has sworn by all the gods that he will never allow himself to believe the earth is round, and give him time enough, and cram that time with experience in the pertinent sphere, he will surely come to and rest in the truth about the form of the earth. That is pragmatism. It's actually very hopeful. Right? It gives me hope as a teacher. It gives me hope as a human being. And if you do read more of the pragmatists, you'll see that hope is actually a pretty recurring theme in all these big classical pragmatists like William James and John Dewey. But yeah, and definitely also in Peirce. Now, you might not be convinced of all this right now, but give yourselves enough time. Thank you guys very much.
Can I get in front of your laptop now?
Yeah, Mitch.
Go ahead, Mike.
Let me go
Just
ahead and
one
stop
second.
recording, actually.
Copy of that.